This is our literary context for the procreation session of Reforming Wisdom. Literary considerations influence how and what we read, whether or not we're aware of it. Those literary considerations include, but are not limited to, genre. Is it apocalyptic? Is it poetry? Source, who wrote this? Style, is it written in a particularly structured style, bookended by certain types of verses with something in the middle that is a pivot? Is it a narrative? Is it have a specific pace? The characters, who's in the story? Why are they in the story instead of someone else? Setting, where is this placed? Is it in the middle of something? Is it on the edges of something? And is that important? Point of view, something as simple as, is this told first person with I's and we's, or is this told from a third person? He and she did this. All of these influence how we hear the words and how we imagine the story. There are two creation stories for humankind. One is from the Yahweh source, which is humanist and relationship-oriented. The other is the priestly source, which is located in time during the Babylon exile. These writers were very concerned with documenting a relationship between God and Israel and what humans could do to preserve it. Knowing the history of the two sources, we can approach these verses with an understanding that this is not standalone story. Aside from all the begats and a very surprised Sarah discovering she's going to have a child in her old age, one of the things that this story makes us think about is sex in the Bible, in terms of why it was created at all. Surely God could have created humanity to reproduce, like the fishes or the flowers. But there was something more than just the physical act of procreation that was important. There was something more than just creating children that caused God to bother with how we have human reproduction. Of course, there are a multitude of reasons. Very few are addressed directly in Genesis at all. This literary form that appears in Genesis is not the place to get into every single one of those multitudes of reasons. Thankfully, Scripture really does inform Scripture, and the question of the purpose of sex is addressed in other places in the Bible. There is some beautiful, poetic, lovely verses that are all about sex, particularly in the Song of Solomon, as well as in the traditional royal psalm 45, among many others. These psalms and scripture take delight in the human form. They take delight in the relationship. They are worshiping with their bodies and telling us about it. These are earthy, descriptive literature, well grounded in a knowledge of the human body. The beauty of the human body is described. The pleasure which we take in the act is discussed. The pleasure of the presence of the other person and what they make you feel or want. The relationship is described, and the comfort which sex can evoke as a deeply relational act is described. Oddly, it is more pleasurable when done for the other than simply for personal gratification. This is a very complex gift that we have been given. And as Genesis comes to the story of Abraham and Sarah, we are still talking about sex. And there is no miracle birth for Sarah. She still is going to have to go through intercourse, impregnation, gestation, and birth. Consider the parts of the relationship outside of sexual intercourse that have to be in working order for this to go well. And we're not talking just about the physical things that need to go well in order for Sarah to carry a child safely to term, but for the tribe of Abraham, the household to continue to function. There are relationships that must work well in order for this baby to be born. Roles for genders as well as for procreation are all present, but it is the relationship that is first and foremost in this story. And the relationship that is mentioned first is the relationship between Abraham and God. Luther's inclusion of the body and the heart in life contradicted the historical focus of Christianity on the soul. For Luther to reorient our daily lives and vocations in a theology that did not discount the body and the heart was truly revolutionary, primarily because they were so rarely acknowledged for the common man. Historically, given the order and the means of interpreting these verses, they can be taken to reflect a hierarchy. But while Luther made no provisions for male or female, humankind or mankind, and these views of women's roles versus man's roles are readily apparent in his commentary, one of the things that this inclusion of earthly desires brings up is vocation. And that vocation is the center in the gap between the human and the divine, and all of the overlap. He says, "Our opponents, the papists, boast of their great and wonderful works, but they laugh at us when we bestow praise on such activities in the household and in civil life that they regard as insignificant and ordinary." No longer were we forbidden to enjoy the ordinary earthly life and strive only for the divine, but we realized that the earthly life is part of that journey. In a literary sense, it is important to understand that the Reformation was closely followed by the scientific revolution and the Age of Enlightenment, taking the human focus off of God and into the observable and the explainable. Luther's inclusion of the human and the divine in all of his writing changes how we think about God without losing God to human reason. The questions that this brings to mind in the literary context are not limited to these. But what does tension as a literary device between sex and relationship due to the reading of this particular verse? Does the emphasis on the covenant of God with humanity, which is in conflict with other voices and source materials in Genesis, result in a different kind of literary tension? How does a comparison of Psalm 8, verses 3 to 5, to Genesis chapter 1, 1 through 26 make you feel? What does it mean that there are two creation stories for humankind, and how does it affect how we think about sex in the Bible, in terms of why was it created at all? How did Luther's reorientation on our daily lives and vocation change how we think about relationships? Did it dismantle the hierarchy, or reorient it, or something entirely different?